Exodus. So we're moving our way into Exodus. 2 weeks ago we looked at Hebrews just to help us to think through how do we read these Old Testament stories, how do we use them for our time today in a very different time and culture. Last week I kind of tried to tackle that big question of when we don't understand God or when God does things that don't make sense to us, or when we feel angry at God. And when we read the book of Exodus, we're going to see some of those, things that God does that are going to make us uncomfortable. And so I just wanted to talk about that directly last week, the kind of a big picture of God. Now this week we're kind of get into the first couple chapters of Exodus, and now we're going to be off and running probably through May. But I want us to think about this question of your name. What is your name? And what does your name mean to you? And how important is your name to you? Is it or not? I mean, some people don't like the name that their parents give them and want to change their name. And then there's a discussion when people get married, who takes whose name? Do you put the two names together like some good people do? And so forth. And so, what is the meaning of your name? And how important is that to you? A number of years ago when I was younger and not married, and I was in a time in life where I could travel around in order to pursue more education, my plan A for seminary didn't quite work out, and so I went to my plan B for seminary. But because plan A didn't work out, I started at the seminary not in September, but in January. So I moved to a new place I'd never been before, started seminary, and I was in a church history course. And it was set up where there was 3 church history courses that you're supposed to take in sequence. And the first course was in the autumn semester, but I wasn't there, so I was kind of joining it in the second semester. And all the other students had all been in Church History 1, so they all knew each other. The professor knew them, and then I was like this new face, that showed up in January for Church History 2. And when the semester started, the professor is going down the roll, checking off who's there and that kind of thing. And he knew most of the students, and I remember very vividly, him coming to my name and saying my name. And of course, he didn't know who I was yet, and so that happened several times. He'd go through the roll, and I would, Mark Sandberg, I'm here, this is me, and it took him a while to get my name. And one time he even said in class, I'll remember your name. I'll get your name. And I remember in my mind thinking, yeah, you will, and I'm going to make sure you remember what my name is. Okay, and so I found a way to make myself memorable to him. It was probably not the most healthy way. It was a good, you don't even know what I'm talking about. Yeah, well, so it can be a mystery to you. But the point is, I wanted him to remember my name, because my name I kind of liked, and it was important to me, and so I was going to do something, that it wasn't a terrible thing, I didn't commit a crime or anything like that, but I made an effort to let my name be known so that he would know my name, and he would never again say, I'll learn your name. But that's the way it is with names, at least for some of us. We want to be known, and who we are is important. And in the beginning of the story of Exodus, that question comes up, for actually several characters in the story. Last week, this is the text that we looked at. In Exodus 34, then the Lord came down in a cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, Yahweh, Yahweh. Now, when I read that last week, I didn't read the words Yahweh. I read the Lord, the Lord. So here in this text, every time you see the word Lord in all capital letters, it's actually the word Yahweh. In a lot of translations, like English translations, they don't put that word, that Hebrew word Yahweh there. They put it as Lord in all capital letters. as a way of communicating to us that it's actually this name. It's this name, but for reasons I won't go into maybe all the details here, that name became so important to the Jewish people that they would not pronounce it. So instead of when they're reading the text in the Hebrew text, they won't change the word. The word in the text will be Yahweh, but when they read it out loud, they will read a different name for God. Okay, and so that's preserved in translations with the word Lord, but that's the name, Yahweh, the Lord, Yahweh. And God is saying, this is who I am. This is who I'm revealing myself to be. Yahweh, Yahweh, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands of generations, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. But as a matter of fact, God doesn't ignore sin either. Sin has consequences, but last week we talked about the heart of God to forgive and to restore. Well, we see in Exodus 34 the importance of that name and that repetition of the name as God speaks to Moses. He proclaims his own name twice. But that's important early on in the story. At the end of Exodus chapter 2, there's this little summary of what's going on, and it says, "Now it came about in the course of those days that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed because of the bondage." Really, God? Really? They're asking probably. "And they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. He heard, he remembered, he saw, he paid attention to them." That's the end of chapter 2, and the first two chapters kind of explain this bondage that they were in. And of course, if you've read the book of Exodus, then you kind of know the details, but you haven't, just to refresh your memory. At the end of the book of Genesis, the small family, Abraham's family, because of famine in the land of Canaan, they go to Egypt. About 70 of them go to Egypt, and there's an amazing story how God provided the way for the people to go to Egypt, and there was food to eat in Egypt, and so they settled there for a time, not in the land of Canaan now, but in the land of Egypt. But they ended up staying there, and they grew and grew till they were quite the large multitude. Over, as it's going to turn out, over the course of about 400 years they were there. They became quite large, and that became a threat to the king of Egypt. And so the text tells us there was a new king who didn't know that story so much. He didn't know Joseph, who had saved Egypt. He didn't know him. He didn't care about that guy. He didn't care about these people anymore. All he saw was, here's a bunch of people living in my land, and they could be a huge threat, and now I've got to put my thumbs on them and push them down and make sure they remain in bondage, so that they're not a threat to my country. And so they were making the Jewish people in Egypt work hard. They had to make bricks, and they had a certain quota of bricks they had to make, and the Egyptians, workmasters, the foremen, I can't even think of English words anymore, might have beat them and so forth, and they were in bondage, and the king of Egypt is still feeling this threat, and so he tells the Jewish midwives, you just have to start killing the male babies. When a baby is born, if it's a male, it's got to die. Now, one of the commentaries pointed out how foolish this was, because if you look at the first couple chapters of Exodus, it's mainly a bunch of women who are doing some amazing things. The midwives, it's the women who are going to do something amazing, and Moses' mother and sister is going to do something amazing. And of course, the Pharaoh in Egypt, he's too blind to that. So there's some irony going on in the story that let's kill all the males. Well, that's not going to help you, buddy, because God can use whoever he wants to use. So in any case, the midwives are told to kill all the male babies. They don't do it. A little bit of civil disobedience. They make up an interesting story. They might have, stretched the truth a little bit. But in any case, God blesses them because in this case, they're going to disobey an unjust order. That's Genesis chapter 1. What happened there? Oh, no, that's right. Sorry. So that's Genesis chapter 1, and then Exodus chapter 2 tells us about the birth of Moses, who now is going to be the key character through the next couple books of the Bible. And of course, Moses is one of the important characters for the entire book. And again, what happens with Moses, an amazing story. And in chapter 1, it might seem like God is absent until this. For 400 years, God has not been absent. God hears and remembers. He sees and he takes notice, and he's going to do something about that. And a baby is going to be born, a boy who is supposed to be killed, but of course his mother doesn't want to kill him. So it's that nice Sunday school story where Moses' mother makes this basket, puts tar around it, makes it waterproof, and she's going to hide her son in the Nile River, in this basket. About that time, the Pharaoh's daughter comes to take a bath, and lo and behold, here's this basket, and there's a baby, and she knows what's going on. She's not too interested maybe in obeying her father in this case, so she says, oh, it's one of the Jewish babies. And it's just a funny story, quick thinking people, and of course God doing things. And so Moses' older sister is there watching this, and she seizes the day, and so she kind of, oh, I see you found a baby kind of thing, and she suggests, I can find one of the Jewish mothers who can nurse this baby for you, who's also the real mother of Moses. How nice. So Moses' mother is going to get paid to take care of this baby. Without this, she wouldn't have, gotten extra income. She's going to get extra income to take care of her own baby. Her baby is going to be preserved, and then her baby is going to end up in Pharaoh's household and is going to grow up getting an education that's going to prove to be rather helpful. She's going to know how to show up at the court of Pharaoh and have a discussion with him. He's going to know the language. He's going to grow up in Pharaoh's household. So that's the beginning of Exodus chapter 2. But then something very important happens, and we talked about this before, a critical choice that Moses makes. He's got to choose, who are my people? He's now spent nearly 40 years living like an Egyptian in the household of the Pharaoh, the king. But he's out and he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Jewish workers, and he's going to intervene. The text says that he looks both ways. Some people read that as, I hope no one is going to see me, and I'm going to go get this guy. It might be that he's looking for the proper authority. The text doesn't tell us it's one of the proper authorities, one of the workmasters who's beating this guy. It might just be a random Egyptian who's beating this Jewish guy. And Moses is saying, where's the official here who ought to fix this? And he doesn't see anyone. And so that's when Moses is like, well, I can't let this go. And so he ends up killing the Egyptian. I don't know if that was a good or bad thing, but that's what happens. And step by step, Moses realizes, I got to get out of here. The Jewish people don't recognize him yet as a deliverer, and now the king of Egypt doesn't want him around, and so Moses escapes to the wilderness at the age of 40, and once again, suddenly, another odd thing occurs. He comes to a well. There's 7 young women there who are taking care of their father's flock. They're trying to water the flock. I'm guessing that their father had no sons. He's got 7 daughters. It's a little bit scary. I think. You guys had 2 daughters, yeah? That might be the maximum a person can handle. I don't know. 7 daughters. And they're trying to water the flock, and there's some other shepherds there who are kind of bullies, and so they're preventing these 7 young women from watering the flock. And Moses shows up, and he drives those guys away, and he waters the flock. And these 7 girls go back to their father and say what's happened, and their father's like, I think he's probably thinking, what's wrong with you 7? Man, here you're 7 single women, and here's some guy rescued you. You guys should bring him home. So they bring Moses there, and now for 40 years, another 40 years, Moses has a place to live and something profitable to do. And he's learning about this wilderness that he's going to spend another 40 years in. So God is just kind of doing some amazing things in preparing this guy Moses, to take the story the next step farther, which is what we get to at Exodus 3 that we're focusing on today. And so Moses is out in the wilderness taking care of the flock, and then he sees this strange sight. There's a bush that is burning. And again, this is another one of these Sunday school stories, and people know about the burning bush, and it's going to come up again in the next couple sermons. And Moses notices that, and he sees that's strange. There's a lot of these words about seeing something, and so the text emphasizes Moses saw this bush, and he was interested in it, and he went to investigate it, and then he hears this voice. An angel of Yahweh speaks to him. And here in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is going to give his commission, and God is going to begin this process of delivering his people. So God speaks to Moses, and he says, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. This is repeated all through these books in Genesis and Exodus. When God speaks to people, he tells them, you actually know about me. I'm the God of Abraham. You know the stories of Abraham. You know how Abraham met with God and talked to God boldly. I'm that God. It's okay. I'm the God of your father. You're actually safe with me. And I'm the God of Isaac. And I'm the God of Jacob. The God that Abraham had this personal relationship with. I'm that God. And I'm here now just continuing that process. So that's how God starts off. And Moses hides his face because he's afraid, as I imagine we ought to be. And then the Lord, Yahweh, says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, and I am aware of their sufferings. Once again, just see how the text piles up those words. I see, I hear, I'm paying attention. I've seen the affliction, I'm giving heed to it, and I'm aware of it. So I have come down. I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And there's going to be that phrase, milk and honey. And if you're not interested in milk and honey, the point isn't just milk and honey. The point is it's a land that can produce that. If you have milk, you have cows, okay, or sheep, and if you have cows or sheep, then you have grassland. If you have honey, you have plants, you have bees, and you have all the rest of it. So milk and honey is literally milk and honey, but it's also a figure for everything that you need. If you're Latvian, you're going to have your kefirs and your honey. You'll have it. To the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. These are tribes that had filled in the land of Canaan, that are, some of them are quite strong places, and of course that's another story, but God is going to dispossess them. It's a hard part of the story, but that's what God's going to do, and he's going to give the Jewish people that land. So again, in verse 9, now look, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. So you have these verbs that are just piled up. about this God that he sees and he hears, he notices, he's aware. He's paying attention. He is paying attention. Even in chapter 1, when his name wasn't mentioned much, he was paying attention. He knows what's going on, and he is not distant. He does not keep himself aloof. He's going to come down and step into the story. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this next point because it's going to come up more and more in the next couple weeks, but when God steps down to do something, and this is very important for us, when God steps down to do something, almost always he's going to use humans to do it. It's going to be God, but it's going to be humans doing it. I mean, all through the Bible, that's a pattern. I mean, from Genesis chapter 2, literally, to literally the last chapter in the Bible. When God is doing things, he's going to be using humans to do it. And it's going to be the same thing here. God is going to deliver his people, but he's going to say, now, okay, Moses, come, you too. I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Who's going to do it? God or Moses? Yes. Yes, they are. They're going to do it. Moses is going to do it. He can't do it without God, that's for sure, but Moses has to do it. God's going to do it, but Moses has to do it. And so here, God tells Moses, the Lord tells Moses, it's coming now. This is what you're going to do. This is what it's going to look like. But then Moses says to God, but who am I? Who am I to do that? So that's his question. And once again, in the next couple of weeks, Nenad and John are going to be here, and they're going to give a lot more details about Moses and this interaction. But for now, just Moses raises the question, who am I? He doesn't yet fully know who God is, and that's part of what the point of this story is. So he's concerned about, who am I to do this? In a sense, that's a good question. I think Deb sent me this image, and this is really a nice little summary of what's happening here. Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, in the household of Pharaoh, and then he spent 40 years learning he was nobody. He's just a shepherd in the desert. And then 40 years discovering what God can do with the nobody. So when Moses was 40 years old, he probably wasn't ready to do this yet. Even though God knew that he was going to use Moses, Moses wasn't ready yet. And God was preparing Moses first, and not till Moses was 80 years old, then he's asking, who am I? But the critical thought for today is this. When we think about who am I, that's a less important question than the question is, who is God? Moses says, who am I? And God's answer, in a sense, is going to be, don't worry about it. Because what's important is who I am and what my name is. And you are going to be okay because of who I am. And who you are is going to come from who I am. And who God is helps us to know who we are and how we are supposed to live our life. But Moses is going to keep questioning God, and again, a lot of those details are going to come up next week. So God says, look, I'm going to be with you, and this is going to be a sign for you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And so most of the book of Exodus is going to happen right in that area of the burning bush. And that's the sign God gives Moses. And when I look at that, I think, this is what makes God so frustrating sometimes. Because this sign isn't going to do Moses a lot of good right now. Because Moses is wondering if, can I do this? Can I make this step? And the sign is, after you have done it, then you'll know it's me. That means Moses has to do it first. And when he's done it, then Moses will say, that was God. God said he was going to do it, and he did it. But the sign is going to be fulfilled only after this long process. Moses wants some kind of, huge blaze of something or other, to make faith easy, to make faith unnecessary. And Moses isn't going to get that. Guys, this is how God can be very frustrating. This sign that God here gives, to Moses, it still requires great faith on the part of Moses. So then Moses says, so suppose then I do this. I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your father sent me to you. And they ask me, well, who is he? What is his name? What am I going to say then? It's really hard to know what all these Jewish people in Egypt really understood about God. Did they do a good job of passing the stories on? Maybe, but maybe not. They didn't have a lot of, probably public worship opportunities in those 400 years. And more than likely, most of the people knew not too much about God at this point. They would have known some basic stories, kind of their family identity, and they would have known the name of Abraham, and there is some God who is involved there, but they've been surrounded by the gods of Egypt, and there's lots of them. And so they probably don't have a clear picture of exactly who God is, and so this question is going to be a logical question. Who sent you, Moses? Who are you, and who is this God, and what did you hear from him, and what does he have to do with us? And so Moses is wondering, what am I going to say to those guys? If they ask, who is this God? So God says to Moses, I am who I am. And this is what you say to them. I am has sent me to you. That can be translated, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. It probably doesn't make a difference how we translate it, because the idea is going to be the same. But this is how God is going to begin to communicate his name and the meaning of his name. I am who I am, but what in the world does that mean? That's like some philosophy student wanting to sound hyper, profound or something, and you ask a question and he asks another kind of question back, and he just keeps asking question, and that's someone who thinks they know what they're talking about but don't really know what they're talking about, and make these obscure, profound kind of comments. Is that what God is doing here? Say to the Israelites, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. So there, the Lord is Yahweh, and that name Yahweh comes from I am who I am. Yahweh isn't literally I am, because we can't say I am. It's He is. The name of God is He is who He is. The personal name of God. That's His identity. That's who He is. That's His name. He is God, but He's got a name. I am a man, but there's a lot of other men. But I have a name, and so who I am is not just a man. I have a name. I'm Mark. That's who I am. Okay, I'm not a generic this or whatever. I don't like labels too much. I don't like political labels. Are you conservative? Are you liberal? Are you this? Or are you that? And I'm Mark. I'm who I am. I've got my own opinion, and it doesn't fit in the categories. This is who I am. Don't put me into some other category. This is me. If you want to know me personally. Yahweh. He is who He is, and He will be who He will be, and that's His personal name. There's lots of other gods that were available. But this God had his own personal name, Yahweh. And God here is beginning to communicate the meaning of that name. And this is important to him. So he says, "This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." Again, there's lots of gods. And there's a generic name for God that is used in the Hebrew that you can find in other languages, and other people would have used the same generic name for God. But only these people now are going to use the name Yahweh. They're going to know their God. They're going to know their God personally. They're going to know their God by name, just as their God is going to know them by name. I am who I am. What does that mean? We have to think about the context of this story to understand the significance of this name Yahweh, the significance of I am who I am. And I've been emphasizing words that have been coming up in the passage, that God sees, and God hears, and God notices, and God moves. God does something. God acts. This I am what I am, people might think of it as, okay, this is the name of God. This is who he is apart from everything else. So this is when God is all by himself, he knows himself by Yahweh. If you're into philosophy and you know the word ontological, that this is like an ontological statement of who God is in his own being all by himself. So you might think, okay, that's who God is all by himself. But no, that's not what's happening in the story. Yahweh isn't who God is all by himself. This is who he is in relationship to people. It's a relational word. It's a relationship word. It's a name that he uses when he comes into relationship with people. It's his name as he acts. And his name is going to be revealed through what he does. If God never intervened in our life, we wouldn't even need to know his name. If he was just out there in his own little private world, separated from us, we don't even need to know his name. But if he's going to come close, if he's going to be in a relationship in our life, if he's going to do something in our life, then a name is going to be important. So he's Yahweh Elohim. In Hebrew, it's really these 4 letters. We're not 100% certain how to pronounce it, but that's more or less how people think you pronounce Yahweh. And then Elohim is kind of the generic name for God. And you can see that word El in other words. So for instance, Emmanuel, a name that we use like at Christmas time, God with us. In Emmanuel, that El is the word for God, God with us. And you can find a lot of names and other words in Hebrew and other related languages that have that word El. It's just the generic name for God. But you could use that name for God for all sorts of other gods. So those other tribes in the land of Canaan, those Hittites and Jebusites and all those other sites, they had their own Elohim. But they didn't know him by Yahweh. The Jewish people learned his personal name, Yahweh. He was their God. So what does that mean, Yahweh? He's a God of personal relationships. Yahweh first appears in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 1, of course, is the story of creation, kind of the basic story of creation. And in Genesis chapter 1, the word for God is Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. In Genesis chapter 2, when it tells the creation story from a kind of a different angle that focuses on humans, when there's interaction with Adam and Eve and so forth, It's not Elohim, it's Yahweh. I think that's intentional in the story. When God is dealing with people, now he's Yahweh. Now he has a name, because that's part of what his name is for and what his name means. He's a God of personal relationships. And he's a God who acts or engages with people. This, I think, explains some words in the Old Testament that we might struggle with about God. For instance, in the Psalms and even in Exodus, it talks about God remembered his people. If you think about that, that should trouble us a little bit. Like, God remembered? Does that mean he forgot? I mean, when we think about remembering, I need to remember something that I'm likely to forget. And because I forget a lot of things, I really need to remember. Is God forgetful? Does he literally not remember people in his mind? Is that what remember means? No, God never forgets in that sense. The word remember is an action word for God. It means God is stepping in and doing something. It's not about what's going on in God's mind. It's about what God is doing. He's remembering his people, and he's doing something about them. We're going to see the word repent for God. God repented, and that's another hard word, and it's not necessarily easy to explain. But again, if we think it's just a mental word, that something going on in God's mind, he repents, does that mean God thought one thing and then thought, oh, that was a bad idea that I had. Now I've got to do something different. I made a mistake. Now I'm going to... Does that what mean God repent? Did God make a mistake and change his mind in that way? No, repent has to do with how we see God acting. From our eyes, it looked like God was doing this. Now God's doing something different. Okay, but it's not God changing his mind. It's in relationship to us, in his relationship with us, God is doing something different. Okay, so it's not a lot of these words that describe what God is doing. It's not thoughts that God has. It's a way of describing actions. When God remembers, it means he's coming close. He sees, he hears, he takes notice, he comes down. So Yahweh reveals a God who acts, he engages with people, faithfully keeping his promises. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. I will do what I've said I will do. I will do what I say I'm going to do because I am who I am. I will always be who I am, and I will always do what I promised to do because that's who I am. That's what this name communicates. He will not change. He does not change. This is who he is. It's who he is. He can't change. There's some things about me. It's just who I am. I have DNA in each of my cells, and it's who I am. And it won't change. Obviously for me, there's lots of things that can and ought to change. But, there's some things that are unchangeable about me because it's just who I am. Once I was conceived and the egg and the sperm came together, that was who I'm going to be. God is who he is and always will be who he is. And he will always do what he says. He will always do what he says. And so in Exodus, it shouldn't really be a surprise to people that now God is doing something. If they had known who he was, like Abraham knew who he was, they would know he's going to do something. He's going to keep his promises. And he's going to do that because of his name. There's lots of reasons why God is going to do things, including because he loves us, okay? But also because of his own name. God is going to protect his own name. And he's going to do it because it's his name. Just like me and my own kind of weakness and stupidity, for human, I'm like, I'm going to make sure you remember my name because my name is important to me. God's name is important to him. And his honor is important to him. And we'll talk later on about why that's important, why it's good news. Why God honoring his name is actually good news for us. But the point is, it guarantees that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. It's who he is. So we sing that song, I'm loved by you. It's who I am and it's who you are. We are who we are because of who God is. And God loves because of who he is. It's his nature, it's his character. It will not change. It will never change for all eternity. So this name Yahweh is a name of personal relationships, and it's a name of action. And so what is going to happen in the rest of the story, and this is Exodus chapter 3 is just the introduction of his name, and he's simply saying, follow the story, watch the story. You want to know who I am? What does Yahweh mean? Pay attention, because you're going to see it. And I'm going to keep revealing who I am, and you're going to see all these dimensions of who Yahweh is. And he's just starting that process here. So just as we finish up, what does this mean for us? For Moses, he's got an answer. How clear it was for him at that point, I don't know, but he at least has something to say. What about for us? Why is this name Yahweh important? Well, number one, I think this is significant because it's part of the way in which our God is different from all the other gods who are possible. Even now, there's lots of other gods that are possible that people worship. There are people who literally worship what they think is God. It might be a demonic spirit or whatever, but there's other gods that are possible. Some of them have their own name, and you can go to some land where they are worshipped, and you can worship that God. There are other gods who are possible. There are other religions out there. You know that. And people have come here, to Riga, and there's lots of other religions that are available here. And is it all the same God? And does it matter which God that we worship? It does matter. Because not every God is Yahweh. Don't choose a different God. And this is one of the things God, told his people when we get to the Ten Commandments. God starts out, you shall not have any God before me. Okay, that's going to be a mistake. If you choose another God, that's going to be your mistake. I've come down and I've come close, and I will be your God. I will be Yahweh to you. But it's got to be me and not another God. In Deuteronomy, there's the Shema, that kind of creed statement that Jewish people have said, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, Yahweh Elohim, is one. And you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. What does that mean when he says God is one? Some people think, well, that disproves the doctrine of the Trinity. We cannot believe that God is also three because this says God is one. But that statement in Deuteronomy is probably not about the being of God, who he is in himself. It's another way of communicating this idea that you are to have one God. You choose me, and if you choose me, forget about the other gods. And this is actually good news. Because the other gods aren't like Yahweh. There's other gods, but they're not necessarily the ones who hear and listen. They're not necessarily gods who come close. They might be powerful or whatever in that religious system, but they're not like Yahweh. They're not overflowing with forgiveness. They're not coming close. Even if you're not sure if this God exists, we would want this God to exist. Because honestly, I can't find a better one than this one. If he doesn't exist, we ought not to worship him. Seriously. If it's not true, we shouldn't believe it. But if it's true, this is the greatest news. That this God is our God. Because there's not a better one out there. There's not a better one out there than Yahweh. There's not a more powerful and loving and gracious and wise and amazing God like this. There's no stories about a God like this God. So as we read the book of Exodus, as we read the Bible, we're going to find a God that's different than the other gods, and there's good reason why we trust in this God and not choose a different God. And then for Moses becomes who he is because of who God is. So Moses asks that question, who am I? And God, in a sense, says, well, the critical question is, who am I? And when you know who I am, Moses, you'll figure out who you are. And it's going to be good. And as we know who this God is, we'll know better who we are. And it will be good. And we'll find our place in the story like Moses finds his place in the story. And who God is will help to give us our identity. And we will find our name, we will find our meaning with God. And then, of course, thirdly, all of this becomes more clear and focused when we think about Jesus, whose name includes Yahweh. The name Jesus means Yahweh saves, or Yahweh is Savior. And Jesus is the God who comes close. Literally close. Literally like us. Literally next to us. Literally sharing a life like us. Born as a baby. Having to have his diapers changed. God having his diapers changed. It's unbelievable. Except it happened. Being hungry. Maybe bullied, who knows? Having disciples who were, pretty clueless half the time. And physically dying. What other God is like that? What other God is revealed in the way that Jesus reveals our God? This is good news. This name of God. And as we read the book of Exodus, it's going to be easy to think, wow, this is bad and this is negative, and God seems to get angry here and God does this. And if we can pay attention to what God is doing and why God is doing it, it's amazing good news. The book of Exodus is filled with the gospel. Okay, and I want us to train our eyes and ears to see and to hear the gospel even in the book of Exodus. Let's pray.